Hi, in this video we are diving into one of the most exciting updates that was introduced in Angular 17, the new model input. By the end of this video, you will be able to create the model inputs and outputs and know how this works. So, if you have used ngModel before, this feature is going to change the way you think about two-way data binding in Angular. So, let's see how this works. So, I got a fresh Angular 20 project which was created using Angular CLI. Now let's open the app.html. Earlier before version 20, it should be app.component.html. So inside that we have the ng model. If you see, we have one input over here, the HTML input element, and within that input we have this ng model along with the username property which is bounded. Okay, so it also has a placeholder. Now the ng model is required to have the forms module inside it, right? So we have imported forms module into the app component. Okay, so that's why it should work. So ngModel will not work if you have not imported forms module in your component ts file. Okay, so now we have bound this username with it, and we have also added the interpolation for the username, right? So this username is basically a signal variable in our app.component. Okay, so now if I go to the browser and see it in action, you see we have one input over here. Within that we have this value. Okay, now if I type something over here, let's say if I remove that, the interpolation that had been added over here, that will be removed, right? So if I type something over here, right, see, you see, this is what the two-way binding it is, right? So we are adding one input into the input HTML input element. Okay, and that input is directly added or directly been shown into this paragraph element. Okay, so that's how I think the traditional ngModel two-way binding works. Now if I want to have a parent child communication, for example, if I have a child component, right, you can see I have one child component over here, and if I want to use that child component with the two-way binding, right, so what we'll do, we'll add a app child component over here in as a selector for the child component, and we'll import the child component over here. So let's do that. So what I'll do is, so this is parent, right? So I'll just update the text over here in the paragraph with this one. So the what parent sees currently over here is this one. Okay, the username, which is the variable of the parent component, which is the our app component, right? And within that we will use the child component, right? So app child. Okay, and now what we'll do is we'll do two-way binding with the child and parent, right? That means the child component and the app dot component. Now to have the two-way binding between this parent and child component, the child component should have the variable, right? So for example, the child component will have a variable which is an input variable, the name input, and a change event, right? The change event should be renamed, or named should be only with the change suffix. Okay, and the name along with the variable name, which is works as an input. Okay, so now whenever there is a change in the input, for example, I have one input in the child component. Okay, so whenever there is a change in the input, okay, I'll call this method with that the value which is the user is being currently typing. Okay, so that value will be emitted from this child component into the parent component. Okay, so now inside our app component, let's go to app.html, and here I will bind the name variable. Okay, the name variable should be bound using the two-way binding. Okay, so I'll use the name variable, and within that I'll use my username. Okay, so now what we'll do is the username variable is being added is being passed as an input to this app child component. So now let's go into our browser and see how this works. So we have this child component. Okay, the child component with the child input along with the paragraph of the child, which what child sees currently. Okay, so child input will have this input, the name, and this parent component has this username. Okay, now if I type something over here, right, that is bound to this child component. Okay, so whatever type over here, that will be updated into this child component with that input, and along with that the input that we have passed, the name input. Okay, now if I type something into the child component, for example, if I remove this, the user, okay, so now one event will be emitted from this child component into this parent component. Okay, so that's how two-way binding works. We have this change, name change event inside our child component, right? So that will be emitted from this child component, and that will be assigned to the variable that we have used inside our parent component, that is the username. Okay, so this is how the two-way binding works traditionally with the parent-child communication. Now, with the introduction of the model input, I don't need this input and output two variables over here, right? I'll only need one variable, which is a model input, right? So, for example, I can do this with the model. Okay, so you see, the GitHub Copilot suggested me that I should use this model as a string type. Okay, so I'll use this. Okay, and I'll comment this the input along with the output, right? So this model, what we are doing over here is that whatever name that is being passed as a input from this parent component, that will be assigned to this name variable. Okay, now if I want to emit any event from this child component, what I'll do over here is that I'll update this variable directly. Okay, so what we can do here is that dot name, okay, dot, and then update. Okay, so update means update takes a function with this along with the value. Okay, so the previous value along with the new value. Okay, so what we'll do is here is that uh, I'll pass one anonymous function. Okay, so within that anonymous function, I'll just assign this value. Okay, whatever value that is being passed from the child.html into this input change function. Okay, so this value will be directly updated to this name variable, and that name variable will have this event emit from this child component to the parent component. Okay, so now we have done this the name input as a signal. So we'll have the signal syntax over here with the name along with the interpolation. Okay, so now we have this model input. Now we have to pass this name variable from the parent component. Okay, so what we'll do over here is that now we have already added the name variable over here, because we have to update it like this. So whatever we have done with the traditional input, name input, with the two-way binding, that's how we can do, right? So we don't need to update anything over here in the parent component. However, we are passing earlier, we have to do the same way. Okay, so now the name variable is having the variable value for the username. Okay, and that will be passed as an input over here, this model. So whenever this the input inside our child component changes, this will call this function input change function. Okay, and with that input change function, that value, the updated value, will be passed as an event emitter from this the name variable from this child component, and that will be assigned into this parent component with the username variable. Okay, now let's see how this works in browser. So we have the same parent and child component. Now if I update something over here, for example, if I am removing from this parent component, you see the child component also receives the same input, the same variable, and that updates the input, right? That updates the name variable over here. Okay, now if I change anything inside the child component, for example, if I remove the force from here, okay, so you can see that input event is being passed, or event emitter is being passed from this child component to the parent component, and that's how the variable is being updated into the child, or into the parent component. One more thing that I want to show over here is that with the model input, you can mark the model input as a required. For example, if you are having a normal signal input, the same way you can mark the model input as required. For example, this as the required. Okay, so now if I have marked the model input as required, this is compulsory, I have to pass from the parent component. For example, if I remove the model input, the name from here, right, the two-way binding name over, I'll get that error, right? So the error says that the required property should be fulfilled. Okay, So you see the required name from the component child must be specified. So I have to add the model input or the required input from the parent component. Now if I have removed the required property, you see the error is gone. Okay. So you can also specify the alias to these model inputs. So the alias for these model inputs can be set using by specifying the initial value to this model input along with the options, right? The options has this alias property, and within that alias property, you can just type the alias name, and for the same name you have to pass from over here. Okay, so that's how alias property works. So I'll remove that alias property which is not required for now. Okay. Now, where to use these model inputs? You can use model input where you want two-way binding support in your component, where there is interaction with the user in both components or the child component. For example, custom form controls like date picker or select elements. And model input gives you the power of two-way binding in a much simpler and modular way. For example, the one that we just saw in this example, right? So the name input have this model, so we don't need two different variables for the input and for the input change, right? So the model input is cleaner, faster, and more future proof for model angular applications. And if you are using signals, model plays beautifully with them. You can bind signals directly with this model input. That's how we have done in in this child component without writing this extra the two lines code, right? So that's the new model input in Angular 20 or Angular 17. Simple, powerful, and fully standalone. If you found this video helpful, make sure to smash that like button. Subscribe to the Frontend Forge. Okay. I'll also share the code repository into this description of this video. Okay. Thank you so much.